Good evening. We'll start in just a minute. All right, I will get started. Good evening, and thanks for Zooming in tonight. My name is Sarah Mills, and I am a researcher at the University of Michigan. I do want to give you an overview of what we'll be presenting tonight and how to submit questions, but I first want to introduce myself a bit so you can understand where I'm coming from. So my PhD is in rural land use planning. I grew up at the end of a dirt road in rural Michigan and came back to school. I got my PhD from U of M to investigate, to find different strategies for farmland preservation. And a lot of that research started as investigating claims that wind energy was a farmland preservation tool that was being talked about in Gratiot County and in Huron County. And so that's what I spent a couple of years doing lots of research in wind farms in Michigan looking at. A lot of that field work, the dissertation research, included surveys of over 4,000 Michiganders who live near wind farms. And so tonight, talking about wind energy, like a lot of this is based on some of that data. But since getting my PhD, which I'm embarrassed to admit was 6 years ago, I've done a lot of more applied research at the university looking at renewable energy policy, public opinion work, and also looking at things including surveying local officials in Michigan about local government fiscal health, so things not even related to energy. But right now, I have a grant that is funded from the State Energy Office, which is in Eagle, the Department for Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And that grant kind of builds on all of this experience, some of that initial research and my subsequent work with townships and cities and counties across the state. And the goal of that is to really facilitate planning and zoning associated with clean energy, to provide some state-based data on clean energy projects, and to then present pros and cons to communities. As part of that grant, we have curated a bunch of resources because there are a bunch of resources out there on wind to help communities plan and zone. We've also been putting together webinars on planning and zoning. We did this last summer and fall through the Michigan Association of Planning and the Michigan Townships Association. And earlier today, we had an introduction to planning and zoning as part of Eagle's webinar series. Prior to COVID, I used to attend Township Planning Commission meetings or board meetings at the request of the local government. And so I'm really happy to be able to do a special meeting for you all tonight. But I'm even happier to have along with me Hannah Smith, who's often been behind the scenes and hasn't traveled with me to those townships, but is through the benefits of Zoom able to come in tonight. So when I said we have been curating resources on planning and zoning, that's really Hannah. She has been really indispensable through in this work. She's combed through the resources that are available online and has been the co-author on 2 of the research papers with me. She's a month away from graduating from U of M with her master's degree in urban and regional planning, and honestly, I'm not sure what I would do without her. So in terms of the format for tonight, Hannah is going to kick off the presentation by talking you through some of the basics about wind energy and why we're even talking about it in the first place. And then I'll pick up with kind of what you should know about wind energy impacts. A lot of that's drawing upon my research, and the basic principles for planning and zoning for wind energy. And then we'll have, Hannah's going to come back and help with the Q&A. In terms of format, we're going to try to talk for about 30 minutes, hopefully not more than 45, certainly. We received some questions ahead of time, actually a bunch of questions ahead of time that I'll answer. And we're also accepting questions via the Q&A function. And I see that some people have already found it because I see that there's some coming in now. So please send along your questions as they occur to you. If we catch them in time during the presentation, Hannah can like insert it right away. Otherwise, we'll come back to them at the end. And while I do need to wrap this up by about 9, because I'm sitting outside my kid's bedroom door and they're probably going to walk by, I think we'll have a good hour for questions. So do feel free to submit them as they come to you. I also want to note that we're recording this webinar, and the recording and slides will be available on the Graham Institute's YouTube channel. So if you Google Graham YouTube, you should find them, and I've got that on a final closing slide. But if you want to submit your email address, which my colleague Sarah Lee is chatting out right now, it's a quick form that captures that email address, and we can email you the link to the recording and to the slides when they're available. And I don't think I had anything else, so I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to talk about why we should be talking about wind energy.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so why are we talking about wind energy? First thing to note is that there are really 2 different scales when we think about wind turbines. So there's the smaller ones that are 40 to 50 feet high that are mostly used on site. So used to offset power on a farm, a residence, or a business. And generally these small turbines tend to not really be controversial. And then there are the utility scale turbines, which modern ones tend to be 450 to 600 feet tall. And those are generally in large developments. And there is some in between. It's possible to have projects with 1 to 2 utility scale turbines, but usually these have some form of alternative type of like ownership structure. So like a municipality owned or a community driven or owned project. This evening, we'll be talking mostly about the larger utility scale wind energy turbines and developments. So looking at what's existing in the state right now, there's currently 2,186 megawatts of utility scale wind in Michigan. A lot of these existing projects are concentrated in the thumb or in the central part of the state, as you can see on the map. And then there are another 11 projects in the queue that are being considered throughout the state right now. And these 11 projects together total 1,900 megawatts, which is almost the same amount as what's existing in the state right now. So it's really clear that development is continuing to be considered and expanded in the state, some of it in the same places as what's existing, but also in new places. So why are we seeing so much activity when proposals throughout the state, consideration of projects? The first thing is growing demand from consumers, cities and municipalities, and corporations, utility companies that are pushing for more electricity generation from renewable sources and committing to renewable energy goals. And then the second thing with wind specifically is that changes in technology are making it a lot more possible statewide. And so a lot of these technology advances are related to the size of the turbines. They've gotten taller over time. So a lot of the older models were about 400 feet tall. Modern turbines are more like 490 feet tall. And then those that are under construction right now or being considered tend to be over 500 feet tall. And this really allows them to catch a more steady winds at that taller height. And this means that more places across the state can viably produce wind power. So then we can turn to think about where in the state that it really is possible to accommodate large scale wind development. So some key considerations when considering where wind development would be a good fit. The first is access to transmission lines and electric substations is really important. These are bigger projects that tend to be located within a few miles of existing transmission lines in order to get electricity from the site to the consumer. And then also thinking about a viable wind resource is important. But as I mentioned, new technology and taller turbines have made that relatively easy to find throughout the state. Another consideration is avoiding endangered species. So for wind in Michigan, this is most commonly thinking about like bald eagles. And developers are required to comply with different state and federal environmental protections that come into play here. And then the last thing, geography and surrounding land use is important. These large-scale developments really tend to be away from urban areas, which is why a lot of urban areas show up as gray on this map. And this is for two reasons. Wind turbine structures and associated rules like setbacks require a large amount of open land. And then also thinking about avoiding wind disruption that might happen from having a lot of taller buildings around turbines in an urban setting. And then I'm going to pass it back off to Sarah to talk about some of the impacts associated with wind energy.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm sorry for rushing you through that last slide. That was unintentional.
You're okay.
I teach on Zoom, and so you would think that I've got it mastered by now, but I feel like there's always something that comes up. So I apologize in advance for any technological difficulties. Okay, so I am going to talk about what you should know about wind energy's impacts. But first, actually, I want to take just one more slide about like maybe Wind Development 101. That's what it's titled. Because it will factor in a little bit when I talk about some of the data that I have from my past survey work. So generally speaking, a wind developer doesn't own the property that a turbine is placed on, but instead enters into lease agreements with developers or with landowners, sorry. The first step in that is to go to a community and figure out who is interested in potentially having a turbine sited on their property. And they usually have them sign some kind of exploratory lease that kind of locks them in for a couple of years with a small amount of compensation. And what developers tend to try to do is get as many landowners as possible to sign up. They take that information back to their engineers to determine where to put the turbines. And where the turbines go is a decision that is based on local zoning and effectively how to array the turbines so that the wind coming off one doesn't impact other turbines downstream. So there's a lot of considerations that go into it. And zoning is among one of them. In a traditional model, there we go. In a traditional kind of the original model that was practiced in the state and that is in play in some other parts of the country still is effectively a winner takes all model, where only those people who ultimately have a turbine placed on their property have a long-term agreement with the wind developer. Usually that agreement compensates them for the disturbance for the actual land that the turbine sits on. So each turbine usually takes up maybe an acre or two, and most of that land is actually in the access road to get to the turbine. Sometimes those lease agreements also include a royalty, which is effectively the profits that are made by selling that power to the grid. In a newer model, which I call pooled royalties, it's called different things by different developers. Instead of compensating just those people with turbines on their property, everyone who was originally approached, who signed one of those leases, exploratory leases saying that they'd be willing to have a turbine on their property, receives some sort of ongoing compensation. Often it's done on a per acre basis, but not exclusively. It's different from place to place. And I'll be honest that I know that different developers use different compensation schemes, but like my expertise is not in the lease arrangement itself. Some developers have what is the newest model, which includes smaller parcels. So people that wouldn't have been originally approached because they didn't have enough land to feasibly site a turbine, but who still may be affected. And the reality is, even on this small parcel, if the landowner puts a cell tower on that property, it may have impacts on the turbines that are downstream. And so these are sometimes called participation agreements or neighbor payments, but there's different developers have different lease arrangements. And so what that also means is that it's not often, increasingly this is the case, not just the person with a turbine on their property who may receive a direct payment from the wind developer. There are lots of global impacts associated with wind energy, but at the end of the day, for communities in Michigan who have the role of setting local land use regulations, it's often the local impacts that are most important. So I'm really going to talk about those local impacts today. First, talking about kind of local benefits, and then what are some local concerns. So stepping through the benefits one in turn. This is data, and again, we'll post the slides so you can click through the links to like read about the results yourself. This is data that's pulled from that initial survey that I did that went out to roughly 2,000 landowners, farmers. That initial survey went out to people in a non-wind farm community as well as in a farming community. You'll see the slide again, that's why I'm gonna walk through it a little bit. And within the wind farm community, I divided the people into 3 different groups. The people with turbines on their property, their neighbors who were in the royalty pool, their neighbors who were paid, and think of that as paid neighbors, and then unpaid neighbors. So we've got kind of 4 different groups of people. These folks are in the wind turbine communities and these folks aren't. And again, the original thing that my research set out to investigate was whether or not wind energy is a farmland preservation tool. And so one of the things that I asked on that survey is whether or not the landowner had a succession plan in place for their property, with the idea that people who have a succession plan in place, who know what's going to happen to their property when they pass, what's going to happen to their farm, are more, those farms are more likely to stay actively farmed. And indeed, we see that people with turbines on their property are more likely than all of the other groups to have a succession plan in place. What people say is that the revenue, the guaranteed revenue that comes from wind development, helps the younger generation of farmers feel comfortable that they're going to be able to weather the ups and downs of the agricultural market over time. Now, the oldest wind farms in Michigan are really 13 years old, 14 years old at this point. And so we haven't seen a generation fully pass. So I don't have data about whether that has actually panned out to be the case. But again, the research on farmland preservation would suggest that having these succession plans in place is a good indicator that that's going to happen. And again, a lot of those succession plans are tied to the fact that those folks are receiving payments for having the turbines. Another benefit of wind development that's tied to farmland preservation as well, and from that initial research that I did, is on farm reinvestment. So I asked about a number of things that the landowner might be investing in their property. So their home or outbuildings, drainage or irrigation, and their equipment. And people with turbines on their properties invest significantly more than any of the other groups. And this is true even when you consider that those with turbines on their property tend to have bigger land holdings. So you would expect them to be investing more. There's people with lots of land also in this non-wind farm group, one, but also I controlled for that. I asked how many acres they owned and how many acres they farmed. And this is true even when you control for that. People with turbines on their property invest about twice as much. And when they're buying things like equipment, and they're making improvements to their house or to their barn, those dollars are largely being spent in the local community. So there's a lot of national information about like how many renewable energy dollars circulate locally this is the kind of thing that they're circulating on when there are landowner payments made to landowners, this is specifically in farming communities, though those farmers are reinvesting in their property and it's circulating through the ag economy that way. But the other thing to note, and I noted in the beginning, is that it's not just farmers that are receiving these payments. Again, it varies from model to model. And so one of the projects that I had a student work on as part of the Eagle grant was understanding, like, what's the identity of the people that are being compensated? How many of them are landowners? How many of them are neighbors? How many of them are absentee landowners? And that's actually a question I think that came up ahead of time. How many of the people who may be signing an agreement actually live there? And that's what this research looks at. And you can again follow the link to it. What that research finds is that effectively the number of absentee landowners that are paid mirrors the number of absentee landowners that there are in a community. So in places where there's a lot of, folks who own farmland but don't actually live there, then you tend to have more people who are getting compensated who don't have local addresses. But even so there's some amount of scale associated with that. But local landowners are more likely, even accounting for those differences from community to community, are more likely to be compensated than non-local landowners. So again, you can dig a little bit more into that. And again, this is also linked to the idea that it depends entirely on the kind of developer's payment scheme, but often it's not just the farmers who are compensated now. Early on that was the case, but that's not so much the case anymore. Apart from this, the direct payments and the economic development effects of the direct payments, wind developers also pay personal property taxes on the value of the wind turbines. So the exact amount that they're going to pay in taxes varies from place to place based on the millage rate and based on the value of the turbine. But for many communities, this is a multi-million-dollar investment. So this is some research that we have that we presented at a conference a couple months ago that looks at 9 different townships. Here it's arrayed from Township A, which has 5 turbines, to Township I, which has, I need to do the quick math, it has 80 turbines. So this is increasing number of turbines, and the dotted lines are when the turbines were built. And this is effectively the taxable value. What's the tax base in their community? And the tax base change from the start of the time period, which was 2005, before there was wind development in any of these places, to the time when it maxed out was 16% in Township A to over 400% in Township I. Taxes are something, because this is like the community-wide economic benefit, this is something that I like to spend a little bit of time on. So I've got a couple more slides digging into this a little bit more. But I want you to look at the shape of the kind of curve over here in Township I, because I think that that's an important thing that communities ought to know. So I said the value of wind turbines are taxed as industrial personal property, so equipment. And the State Tax Commission sets a tax table for wind turbines. This is the multiplier that's from 2014 until now, that tells local tax assessors, effectively gives them a guide for what kind of multiplier to apply to it. They don't call it depreciation, but in reality, they're assuming that there's some kind of depreciation over time. That's what this tax table assumes. That in year 1, you tax 100% of the value, and then that goes down to 30% of the initial value once you're some years out. This revenue, like this is the tax table that applies to the county taxes, the township taxes, to any school taxes. Usually most schools are funded from the school aid fund, and so effectively you receive most of your revenue based on a per pupil basis. But in places where there are debt funds effectively, or sinking funds from the school district, those school districts would also see some of this tax benefit, and ISDs also benefit. Effectively, this same tax table applies to like all of the taxing units associated with property taxes. So one of the things to note is that the most amount of taxes are going to come in year one. And because of this table, by year 12, you're down to 30% of the initial boosted value that you get. Still above the, no development, but it does decline over time. And on wind energy in particular, there were 3 changes to this tax table in 4 years. And so I got a couple of questions about tax tribunals, and I'll go over the specific language later. But at one point in time, most of the wind turbines in the state of Michigan were tied up in tax court because local assessors were applying one table when the wind developers thought that they should be applying another table. And a lot of it goes back to, I think, this change in tables. So that's one thing to note. The other thing to note is that even though there's a huge increase in value in some communities, again, that township I talked about saw their tax revenues increase 400%. It's not always felt by residents. So I feel like most residents don't know what it takes to run local government, like how much taxes are coming in, or how much revenue it takes to modify roads. In talking to the township supervisors, as I did in my research in all of these places, this makes a big difference, even in places that only have a few turbines. But this is a survey question that I asked on a survey from 2016. And that survey was funded by the Mott Foundation, which is out of Flint. I asked people who own property in these communities whether their township services improved as a result of wind development. And you can see that even though this place is getting the most revenue, there's clearly an outlier, and that's here in Township E. Township E introduced trash collection. All of the rest of these townships use the revenue to, do additional dust mitigation or pave an extra mile of road or something. And so it was difficult for residents to see. So what I would say is, among the big economic benefits associated with wind development is the tax revenue. That's something that can apply to the entire community. But how visible those benefits are really depends on how they're used, right? How the local government chooses to use that revenue, and also on the amount of money. In the more turbines you have, the more revenue would be coming in, and so there's a scale effect there as well. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox about taxation and move on to the other local benefit associated with wind energy, which is jobs. So there's a bunch of talk about clean energy jobs, especially right now. And I don't dispute the overall numbers in terms of the number, the percentage of people that are or could be employed in clean energy. I think it's really important for communities who are thinking about hosting a wind farm to understand that most of those jobs are not going to stay there for long. So during construction, there's a bunch of jobs. Many of them are in kind of the civil works, so hauling gravel or kind of, moving dirt, or in the hospitality sector, because there's a lot of special equipment and special labor that comes associated with the projects that is hosted in the community for some time, but it's really the, restaurants and the hotels that kind of see a lot of that business. I wondered about how many long-term jobs there actually are. And so there's another kind of short paper looking at how, the jobs that are left once the wind turbines are constructed. And what we find is that it varies from wind farm to wind farm across the state, but it tends to be about 1 job for every 10 or 20 megawatts of power. So again, the number of jobs, long-term jobs, maintaining the turbines is kind of going to scale to the size of the wind farm that you have. But if you want to read more about that, you can find it here. Again, acknowledging that there are jobs in renewable energy, but not a whole bunch of long-term jobs. For a rural community, a few jobs might be a really good thing, but don't expect this to be like a huge long-term job generator. Okay, so in terms of local benefits associated with wind energy, a whole bunch of them are economic, and you'll see me come back to that idea a little bit later. There are also local concerns associated with wind energy. And one that often comes up at the Planning Commission or when zoning is considered is noise and the impact that wind turbine noise might have on public health. In part, it's because it's the job of zoning to regulate this is written into the state enabling statute to regulate the public health, safety, and general welfare. And so this is a thing that's what zoning is supposed to do. That's one of its primary purposes. In terms of the noise itself, whether people feel like wind turbines are noisy, people are divided. So in my survey research, about half of the people, 52%, said that they disagree that turbines are noisy, and the other half agree that turbines are noisy. This is one I like to highlight. It's not that like everybody who's paid thinks that turbines are silent, or everybody in the communities that have wind farms already operating. Those that are unpaid all think that they're super noisy. There's a mix, right? So the idea that wind turbines do generate some noise is something that is shared. How problematic that is depends on kind of where you sit in that community. And this links to the link with health. So most of the medical research about the impacts, about wind turbines' impacts on human health, find that there's not a direct causal link, that wind turbines themselves, whether they're noise or the flicker that may be associated with them, that there's not a direct link between that and human health impacts. But, and this is an important caveat, but there's a lot of research associated about or talking about an indirect link. There's a lot of ongoing research right now. And that indirect link is associated with annoyance. So some people tend to be more annoyed by having wind turbines nearby, and there's ongoing research to understand if that's related to the noise, if it's related to the visual impacts, is it related to how they just feel about the project more generally. But for whatever reason, some people are more annoyed, are highly annoyed by having wind turbines nearby, and that annoyance can have physiological impacts. So that's kind of the relationship with health. It comes up a lot, and that's where the body of medical research is. Another concern that often comes up that's a local concern is about wildlife. Sometimes, just like any construction project, there is going to be impacts to wildlife during construction. But for wind energy, the primary consideration or concern that some people have is about during operation. Most of that concern is around birds and bats. And like most things, the impacts really depend on where the turbines are sited. So early wind turbines in the US were sited in mountain passes in California, which just so happened to be a major flyway for birds. And so that was a bad place to site turbines. Highlighting this, there is, this is from the National Audubon Society, effectively saying that they strongly support wind energy that is sited and operated properly. So many environmental organizations are in favor of wind energy when it is appropriately sited. And kind of coming back to the link with farmland and why farmland is often chosen is because one of the least impactful places for siting turbines in terms of wildlife is on farmland. The other concern that often comes up is about visual impacts. So as Hannah mentioned before, modern turbines are 500 to 600 feet tall, and so they are really difficult to camouflage. The visual impacts associated with them are during the day, and that's something that you can imagine. But I feel like less talked about is the visual impact at night. So the FAA requires a blinking red light on the top of the turbine so aircraft don't hit them. There is a technology that allows for the lights to be turned off when an aircraft effectively sets up a radar system and turns off the lights, except when an aircraft is nearing the wind farm. But that's something that, first of all, you have to ask the FAA if it's appropriate for your particular wind farm, for your particular project. And so it's kind of at the FAA's discretion about whether that can be practiced. And the last I knew, and I have not checked on all of the wind farms that are under development right now at this moment, but the last I knew, that technology was not used in wind farms in Michigan. And so it's not the default. It's not something that you have, generally speaking, unless you ask for it. In terms of whether or not people are concerned about the visual or aesthetic impacts, again, like asking people, do turbines create a visual or aesthetic problem? It's split 50-50. There's slightly more people, it's 51-49. So 49 people say, yes, turbines are ugly, and 51% say, no, they're not. And again, it's divided between paid and unpaid. Like, there are people who are compensated who don't believe that turbines are beautiful, but also people who aren't compensated who don't see that. So again, I highlight this because often this is seen as like a have and have-nots divide, and that's not totally the case here. Something that is often, this concern about visual impacts often spills over to concern or questions about property values. The most authoritative research from the US, which is this study here from Ben Hone and colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, doesn't find that there's an impact on nearby property values, but there's mixed evidence from other countries. And so I think the one that I'm most intrigued by, honestly, is this paper from Vin looking at Ontario. There's no specific study right now on Michigan, and the people who did this study are working right now on an updated study that covers development that's happened in the last decade, to see if they can try to square kind of what is seen in some other studies. So I don't have an answer right now, and I certainly don't have anything specific for Michigan, but want to acknowledge that there are differing opinions on property values. This is the authoritative US source, but here's something to read from another country as well. One of the things that I think, though, sums up whether people see wind energy as a net positive or a net negative for their community is this last bullet about, this is not why I moved here. So often when people have moved to a place for the view, right, they want to enjoy the night sky or get out of the city, and they just like a pretty rural landscape, they are more likely to see wind energy as not fitting in with that. Because again, you can't camouflage a wind turbine. There's only so much you can do. When people are living in a place for other values, maybe they do think it's a nice, pretty place to live, but they also place a productive value on their landscape. They see wind energy as another way to make that land productive, another way to make money off their property. Doug Bassett and I, he's a faculty member at Michigan State, just had a paper that came out at the beginning of the year that's highlighting this finding. I mean, I think the title of this, Farmers versus Lakers, sums this up. What this paper finds is that in places where there's more farming activity, there's less opposition to wind energy. And in places with high natural amenities, there's more opposition to wind energy. I don't profess to know all of the ins and outs about Pine Township or Montcalm County, but my sense from kind of reading newspapers is that you've got a little bit of both. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's differences of opinion about how wind energy fits. And that brings me to the bottom line on wind energy and what that means for kind of planning and zoning. So the bottom line, effectively, is that wind energy is an economic development tool. It is one tool. And you need to consider how that fits. I encourage communities to consider how that fits with their overall strategy for economic development. If the goal is to sustain agriculture, right? And again, this is where I started. I put out kind of who I am and what I do, because I think that's really important to acknowledge. I started looking at wind energy because I was interested in whether this was a tool for agricultural land preservation. And if your goal is to sustain agriculture, then wind can fit. It doesn't take tons of land out of production, and it is providing farmers with a diversified income stream. However, not all rural economies are based on agricultural production, or that is not their goal for economic development. In communities where the goal for economic development is for substantial residential development or growth of tourism, wind might not be the right fit, because those are groups of people who often place a hefty kind of aesthetic value on the landscape. And again, not everybody thinks wind turbines are ugly, but it's certainly a change. And so, it changes what that view is. So a lot of my work through EAGLE has been to encourage communities to proactively plan for renewable energy and then set zoning ordinances associated with that. Oftentimes I get, pulled into townships when they've been approached by a developer, but don't have any planning or zoning rules, on the books associated with that. So what I tell people generally, and this slide you'll see if you want to watch the webinar that I did earlier this morning, is pulled right from that. The step one is to plan first and figure out how renewable energy, in this case wind energy, fits with your long-term plan. Again, for local economic development, because I think for most communities, utility scale projects, like that is what, that's the development proposition here. For land use, think about what wind farms don't take up very much land individually, but can span over large landscapes. As Hannah said before, it's rare to see one utility scale turbine alone. Usually we develop wind farms because of economies of scale, because it takes special equipment to erect them. So they span landscapes. So what's the goal for land use? Sometimes in some communities, especially when we're talking about solar too, there are plans in place for climate action, and so that can come into play as well. Thinking about renewable energy within your long-term plan, which is what zoning is intended to be based on, then you can think like, what sort of energy, at what scale, in which parts of the community, because that's going to help inform your zoning. On-site use of renewables, small wind turbines that was shown in one of Hannah's pictures, rooftop solar panels are typically uncontroversial. And so are generally not, honestly, in many places they are, maybe the local zoning ordinance is not explicit about what the rules are for rooftop solar panels, but they're so non-controversial that they're just considered some other roofing material. But for utility scale renewables, often communities need to give more thought about where they fit. We have in 2 weeks, Hannah and I are giving a webinar that's specifically about planning and zoning for wind energy for people who don't have wind within their master plan or within their zoning ordinance, to help them think through kind of what sort of master plan goals wind links with. And again, these are things that often appear in master plans, local economic development. So is it ag-based? Is it tourism-based? Is it housing, more jobs? How wind fits is going to vary based on what those goals are. What are your goals for land use? Do you want to retain farmland? Or again, do you want to see single family residential development? Do you want development to be more amenity focused? Sometimes when people are doing brand new master plans, they are explicit about energy. Oftentimes, master plans updates, take quite a bit of effort. And so what communities do is think about how wind energy fits with existing goals and objectives. Within Pine Township's master plan, this is the snippet, and this is the version that I have. So if there's a different version, let me know. My reading is that there's nothing explicitly on energy within the master plan, which is really common. Not very many communities have explicitly mentioned energy within the master plan. But this community vision that's right here talks about ag land preservation, and managing new growth, which again, kind of given the pros, like where wind tends to fit, would suggest that wind may be a good fit here. At the same time, right, there's a bit of conflict, because this kind of clause here about consistent with community character. Community character is often used in master plans to suggest like not very much change. And I recognize that this is a change to the landscape. So that would suggest there's some evidence that that's not such a good fit. Like, and it's not uncommon for there to be conflicting goals within master plans. And that's not for me to arbitrate. That's really a decision for the kind of township to arbitrate. You do have a master plan, and so effectively you don't necessarily need to go back and totally redo your master plan. Your master plan could make an argument either way, again, based on the overall goals of the master plan. Oops, sorry, I'm moving too fast. Ag preservation is one of the key things, and managing growth is also in there, which tends to suggest a good fit for wind. The next thing to do that I tell communities to do is then make your zoning match your master plan. Hannah went over this in the webinar earlier today. Specifics matter for your ability to realize your plan. So if you think that wind is a good fit, then you want to align your zoning to match that. If you think that wind does not fit in most of your community, there's only a small area of your township where wind might fit, then you want to make sure that the specifics of your master plan of your zoning ordinance spell that out. I push on people that you're really unlikely to satisfy everyone, no matter what you do. Generally speaking, people have differences of opinion over the setback distance, and just taking the average of all of the suggested ideas it's going to satisfy no one. And that's not how zoning works. You got to go back to like, what is our master plan? And so where do we see the fit for this energy technology within our master plan? I should say it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be a free-for-all in your township. It doesn't have to be no place in your township. I'm not a lawyer, Hannah's not a lawyer, but we tell people to beware of completely zoning out a land use. But I can tell you, quite honestly, making it really hard for a land use seems to be okay. There are restrictive zoning ordinances that don't completely ban the technology, but that make it okay. But again, a lot of that it's got to be based on your master plan and how you're thinking about it. Again, my reading of Pine Township zoning ordinance suggests that wind is compatible in almost all districts, which is probably why you've been approached by a developer. The majority of your township is zoned to allow for wind development in terms of specific districts. There's setback distances, and there is a setback distance and a noise ordinance, but it's not so restrictive that you're not seeing development again, or you wouldn't have a developer here. I should also say it's not like it's the most permissive in the state. I mean, there are places in the state that are completely unzoned where there are wind developments. There are places that are zoned, but that have, that have less restrictions in terms of setback distance or higher noise limits. I want to acknowledge, like, your zoning ordinance does include a decommissioning plan, and there were a bunch of questions about decommissioning that I'll get to in a minute. But overall, you have few other restrictions. And so one of the questions that came in is like, why us? Like, why did the developer choose us? Well, my guess is that there's probably energy infrastructure nearby. There must be transmission or a substation. And you have an ordinance that suggests that this is a good fit for your community. And so that's among the reasons why. Great. I am going to actually pull up those questions now. The questions that we got before. Hannah, I'm thinking, is working on organizing the questions that came in. I want to, before I turn off the screen share, I want to say that you can feel free to reach out to either of us. These are our email addresses, and tell you again that the recording will be available later at the Graham YouTube site, so you can Google that. And Sarah, actually, if you can copy and paste that again, just in case there are people that joined after you you chatted out the link. The link that Sarah is going to chat in just a minute, again, is if you want the direct link to the recording, you can submit your email address through this short form and we'll send it to you when it's available. All right, so now I'm going to stop sharing and pull up questions that I saw come in earlier, unless Hannah, you want to jump in if there's anything that I should answer first, a question of clarification or anything.
I think you are good to go to some of the questions that were asked ahead of time. Okay.
And folks, again, we've got over an hour, like I don't turn into a pumpkin until 9 o'clock. But in terms of the number of questions that came in, I mean, there were a couple submissions earlier that included like over 20 individual questions. So I'm going to rapid fire trying to get as many as we can. And yeah. Okay. Let's see. So why is this being proposed here, which I just dealt with, so I'm gonna move on. The next question is, should we change our ordinance? So what I would say to that is that zoning isn't set in stone. And so you could change your ordinance, but generally it should be changed based on shifting community goals, which are articulated in your master plan, or shifts in the technology or what's known about the impacts of those technology. So I don't know if you feel like, what the goals that are articulated in your master plan still hold. I mean, that's a question, like the vision statement that you have about ag preservation and managing new growth, like that's a question for you all. In terms of a change in the technology that shifts the intent, again, the technology, as Hannah mentioned, has gotten taller over time. It's not, I don't know though that it's a complete step change. And so that's something that you would have to decide. You don't currently have a zoning ordinance that is pegged, that ties into a specific height. So there's not a height restriction necessarily. Is that, Hannah's gonna help me fact check on that. Is that right, Hannah?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Oh, sorry, she's busy. Height restriction, I can't remember if there's a height restriction in the ordinance. Sometimes ordinances do have a maximum height limit, and I don't remember seeing one, but she can look that up.
Yeah, I'll get back to you 1 second.
Okay, thanks. But also, like, the fact that the setback distance is a multiplier of the height allows for it to scale with that technology. And so in some ways, the existing ordinance is sort of future-proofed that way. Changing the ordinance would let you modify regulations or the districts that it applies to, and it also opens like the ordinance up for a vote. So when the state law says that when you make a zoning change, so that is to the zoning map or that's to the individual text, there can be a referendum vote effectively. With enough petitions from folks in the community, you can put it up for vote in front of the to the people that are registered voters in that community, and the community is wherever the zoning is held. So this would be at the township level. One of the things that's really important is that the change to zoning applies to future projects. If you have a project that's already been submitted, has submitted information, you have to evaluate projects based on the rules when they were proposed. Again, there's a lot, like some of this is stepping into legal territory. This is my best information. This is one where you can totally like get the advice of a township attorney. But generally speaking, that's how it works. So the decision about should you change it, that's not for me to make. This is a community decision. The kind of impact of changing it or why you might change it, that's what I just said. There was a question associated with, related to that, which is like, has technology changed? Wind turbines have gotten taller over time, and they have. And I think I answered that in terms of, you know, if there's something in your master plan about like what is a maximum height that you're interested in having, then sure, like I think that you could make that case. I didn't necessarily see anything, but if that was something that was articulated as a big community goal, then it would make sense to put a height limit on this and to put a height limit on other things. One of the, I didn't include this slide in this presentation, but one of the other kind of principles that I often push is the idea of consistency. So not picking on one particular land use just because it's new. Instead, like think about what else you require noise limits on and applying that consistently across the community.
Sarah, I was just going to mention, going back to the height question with this. So there wasn't in the ordinance right now, from our read of it, there's not a height restriction necessarily. The only way that height is really mentioned is defining between like a large scale system and a small scale system. And so, yeah, that is not,
Super.
There's not a specific restriction.
Thank you very much. See, I don't know what I would do without Hannah. She's got a much better memory than me and can more quickly like look it up. There were a bunch of questions that came in that I want to acknowledge, but that are really, I think, questions for the developer. So a lot of those are about what landowners who enter into a contract are allowed to or not allowed to do regarding like talking to other people, or whether or not like how many people who have signed a lease are living in this, living in the township versus somewhere else. I don't know. That's a question for the developer. Let's see. There was a question about what language should be written into the leases to guarantee that there's funds set aside to cover the cost of decommissioning. And this actually comes to, I think it's helpful to talk about decommissioning. So decommissioning is the idea that at the end of the useful life of the project, when the turbines like are done, they've produced their power. The idea that you don't just leave them there, that you decommission them, that you remove them and return the landscape to some pre-development state. There's often two different ways that is covered. Usually that's part of a lease agreement with an individual landowner. So that, there's some agreement between the wind developer and the landowner whose property it's on, that land will be returned. And sometimes actually the landowner doesn't want it totally returned to the way it was because they want to keep that access road that was built to get to the turbine. But usually that's covered in the landowner lease. And if you're a landowner, like you should look into that. Again, I have no expertise to be able to evaluate that other than to say that's often covered. The other side though, is that there's often decommissioning is included in zoning regulations. And that, as I mentioned, is part of the existing Pine Township zoning ordinance. So it requires a decommissioning plan, and Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, but it also includes that the developer needs to provide information on how ensuring that there's going to be funds around to make sure that the turbines can be taken down. We went over this briefly, it takes big equipment to put turbines up. It also takes some equipment to take them down. So there is some cost. What the total cost of that decommissioning is, which is a question that was asked of me, and I don't know, depends on kind of what is, how many turbines there are, because the cost per turbine is going to be different if you've got to deploy that equipment for taking down 5 versus taking down 50, right? Like that, it's the same truck, but it's the deployment cost. There's an economy of scale associated with that. So you're going to save some money there. But also it can change over time based on what the scrap value is for the turbine components. Sometimes people want to pay you for some of the things that are in it. Or if it's determined that these things shouldn't be going to a landfill, turbine components shouldn't be going to a landfill, and there's an additional cost associated with that. So often what communities do within their decommissioning, or like the decommissioning section in their ordinance, is require the developer to have an engineer recalculate this, revisit every 3 to 5 years. And that allows you to accommodate changes in the kind of market to make sure that that there's enough money in the kind of surety bond or kind of letter of credit, that if the developer doesn't take the equipment down, that there's a financial guarantee that the township can do that. So that's a long answer to the question, what should be included in a land lease, but hopefully educating more on the local government side of things as well. There was a question, what about my property rights? And I don't know who my is. So this is a question though that comes up a lot, and it actually comes up from both sides. So I want to acknowledge that. Sometimes it's from landowners who want to use their land for energy production, and they want to make sure that they retain that property right. And sometimes that question is from those who don't want changes on their neighbor's property that's going to impact the enjoyment of their property, right? So kind of their right to enjoy their property. Overall, while the overall purpose of zoning is to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare, often what gets bundled together and what at the end of the day zoning does is often negotiate, set those expectations, and try to ensure property rights on both sides. So this is among the reasons that we have setback distances, to make sure that if something happens to the turbine, right, that it doesn't fall onto your neighbor's property. Again, at least in the current ordinance, there is a setback distance associated with that. That is the reason why there's often noise ordinances included, to help to allow the property owner who wants to develop their property to have that ability to do that, but also protect the neighbor who worries that the development happening next door is going to impact their property rights. This is where oftentimes it's hard to come to a balance. You cannot please both people, because the larger the setback distance is, the fewer turbines the landowner who wants to have it can have on their property. And the smaller the setback distance is, the closer you could potentially get to your neighbor's property and them feeling like you are infringing on their property rights. And so just averaging them often makes neither person happy. There's no setback distance that's gonna maximize the development ability for the landowner who wants it, or to be a large enough setback distance to make all of the people who really don't think that this land use fits in their community feel comfortable. It's hard. I thankfully don't have to make that decision for the community. But I want to acknowledge that often comes into play in discussing, what is the right balance here. Let's see. Is there anything else, Hannah, that came in that addresses any of those things, or should I just keep going through the list of the things that came earlier?
I think you're good to keep going, and then we can go through some of the ones that have come in that either haven't already been addressed just after we go through those ones from before. Okay, sounds good.
A question that came in a couple of different forms, which is, why can't we just vote on whether we want them or not? And so I told you before about when a vote is required, right? So when there is a change in zoning, either to the requirements or the map, if enough people sign, if enough voters in that community sign that they want to vote on it, state law says there has to be a vote. It's called a referendum. Again, only those who are registered to vote in the township will vote. And generally speaking, those who are most passionate will show up. So there was another question that came in about, it was kind of a comment question, which is, of the 24 times or however many times that wind turbines have gone to a referendum, why has wind development lost every single time? I don't know the exact number, and I don't know like whether there's something specific about the way that it was written. The basic gist is that yes, there have been lots of referenda where ultimately the side that doesn't want wind prevails. But I would also say that that's not exclusively the case. So there was a referenda in Huron County in 2010 that passed. I mentioned before that people who show up to vote are often those who are most motivated. I mean, that's the same people who, like, often the people who are most motivated show up to speak at, you know, public hearings, show up to rallies for things. And I mean, I can say this from experience. I sit on a planning commission, and so like I get this, and always have to think about like what's the overall sentiment in the community? Like, how should I put what I'm hearing into context? I did not design this experiment this way, but I actually had one of the surveys that I did in the past was in Huron County in 2016, and it went to some of the same people who also voted on a referenda about a wind farm there. I asked them whether or not they would support additional wind development in their township, and that's actually what they were voting on. And from my data, I found that like it was pretty close. There were a lot in terms of attitudes about wind energy, and I should have included a slide and I didn't. Ultimately, like on the survey, slightly more people said that they were in favor of additional wind development than said they were opposed. But at the referendum, that was not the case. The overall voters voted against the expansion of the wind farm or the new wind farm there. Overall, more people took the survey than voted. So that's an indication that like, getting people to show up to a vote is, I mean, that's an ongoing challenge in, much of the state. But also, if you look at the percentage of people who told me that they strongly support new wind development and those that told me they strongly oppose new wind development, the proportion was almost identical to those who voted, like what the voting outcome is. So that's an indication, like another kind of mini experiment that like it's the people who have very strong opinions who will likely show up to vote. I don't know what the overall sentiment is in your community, but that's a long-winded answer, probably too long-winded to the like, why don't we just vote? There could be a vote if there's a change in zoning. Let's see. There was a question about my funding, and I think that this is helpful to address head on. I'll read the question verbatim. Has any portion of your research been funded by any energy company? If so, which ones? And how has DTE funding influenced your research or presentations? I have absolutely no funding from DTE or any other energy company. The funding for me being here tonight, for Hannah's time that she spends on this, comes from the the State Energy Office, from EGLE, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. A lot of the research that this is based on came from either my dissertation research, which was kind of cobbled together, and it included funding from a Dow fellowship. The Dow Corporation has has a fellowship within the University of Michigan, so some of it came from that. And some of the survey research also came from that the grant that I mentioned from the Mott Foundation, which is out of Flint. Let's see. There's a couple questions about taxes. One is about litigation between energy companies, and which I think I addressed, but the idea is the way the tax system is set up, there's often litigation about kind of what is the what is the right taxable value? And in the past, particularly for wind energy, there was this history, in part because of the changing of the tax table, but I don't know that it is exclusively because the changing of the tax table, where a bunch of tax bills were effectively, wound up in tax tribunal. A question about whether I am unbiased and willing to inform residents that they depreciate their equipment to avoid paying taxes. The way that the way that it's set up is that that developers, that assessors are supposed to be following the depreciation schedules that are published. My understanding is that the bulk of the of the cases that wound up in tax tribunal were associated with effectively which multiplier table to use. There may be instances of others where there is a quibble over like what is the current value. The tax stuff I'm interested in, and I think it's an important question, and I want to be transparent that like it has come up in the past, and so it's really helpful to think about, to make sure you're understanding like which units of government, like which services might benefit, and to know that the tax table could change. There's nothing saying that the state tax commission is not going to change the tax table that I showed you. There's nothing and that's not in the township's control, and it's not in the developer's control either, but it's not in the township's control. So this is the best information that's available right now, but all of that, like how local governments in the state of Michigan are able to tax things are subject to state rules. So let's see. What can landowners do if they are unhappy with the new visual aesthetic created by the introduction of turbines to the landscape? I'm not sure. It's probably like what their recourse is the same things that they can do if their neighbor paints their house a color that they hate. I mean, not to be flippant about that, but like if it's allowed by the local government and your neighbor does something that you don't like, I mean, you can like complain about it when you drive by. You can put up a fence, you can move, and I'm not suggesting that, but like when, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of land uses and discretion given within zoning. That's what it confers, is it sets the expectations about what you can do with your property, but also what your neighbor can do. Sometimes, like your neighbor paints their house the color that they like and it's fine and dandy, but maybe you don't. And so while I recognize that this is different, there's not much recourse if it is allowed, and it's in compliance with the local ordinances. Let's see. Okay, now I'm getting to a huge list of questions that came in. Most of them are many of them are questions for the township. And so I want to enumerate the questions that came in that I think really are questions that should be asked of township officials, which is how will visual impact be considered if or when windmills are placed? So that is kind of what, my reading is that that's not considered, that's not in the zoning ordinance right now. And that's actually a tricky one, but that's a question that you would ask of the township. Are noise disturbances being considered? And I would say the zoning ordinance right now includes a noise threshold and there's sound modeling that's required. But I don't know if that's kind of beyond that. What are the effects on the rural landscape of constant blinking lights? That's something that I mentioned, and it's possible, again, if the developer can apply to FAA for a technology that doesn't cause that, that's not usually the default, and so usually they're asked to do that or compelled to do that from the ordinance. And the question is, has this been considered? I didn't see it in the existing ordinance. I don't know what the township and planning commission and board have considered. And also to note, that is a new technology. Like that's a relatively recent technology, just in the past 4 years or so. What's the effect on local bird populations and how do you plan to measure this? I mentioned before that, kind of considering what impacts on birds is important and that some places are better than others. I am not the person to ask, like, I don't have that information. If you're interested, I can try to point you to folks that maybe at MSU Extension who might know, or put you in touch with, the Nature Conservancy, others within Michigan. How do you plan to measure this? That's again a question really for the township, but my reading is that's not necessarily something that's currently in the ordinance. And again, also something that's really hard to set a metric behind. How do you plan to address public concerns as they come up? And that's something, again, for the local government. Oftentimes, if the concerns are about, this is about noise, lights, decreased property values, some of those things are covered in the ordinance, like noise and being within compliance of the noise thresholds, or being within compliance of the light requirements. Some of them are not in this particular ordinance, and so that I don't know if there are other ordinances in play in the community that might be included in. The question is, what fact finding has occurred? Have nearby townships been visited and consulted? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's actually a question to the township or to the developer, in terms of fact finding or kind of the coordination with local governments. I should say that oftentimes wind farms in the state, like wind doesn't conform to township boundaries, right? Like Michigan is largely set up as 6 mile by 6 mile townships, and the wind resource doesn't obey those. And so it's very common for wind projects to span townships and to sometimes even span county lines. This can make it tricky, and this can make it tricky to develop in wind projects or solar projects or anything in the state of Michigan, because it's the townships that have those decisions. In many other states in this region, it's a county kind of decision, but we have very local control. Because that local control can make it tricky, there's places like, Gratiot County is actually nationally celebrated as this example of like the townships realizing this, the townships coming together kind of in coordination with the county, saying like, hey, wind energy is something that could be good for us. Like it builds on our, largely ag for kind of the ag sector. Again, this is like what tipped off my initial research. They decided that one of the ways that they could make it easier to attract wind, they were at the time, like with shorter wind turbines, like they weren't the windiest place. Like the windiest place was in the thumb. And so they wanted to attract wind development to their community. And one of the ways they can do it is to make it easier. And so they said, let's come up with an ordinance that townships can adopt. So even though it's still township zoned, and townships have the discretion, we're going to try to make it more simple by having a similar ordinance across township lines, because the wind farm that could be built would cross township lines. And so kind of the idea of talking to neighboring townships comes up, and probably like whether that's a question to the developer or to the township, I think I wouldn't be surprised if there was if a proposal would span townships. Let's see. There was a comment about making the windmill company's contract offered to landowners part of the township public record. That's I don't know how that works. I put it broadly in the bucket of like township things, maybe. Has the township reviewed studies regarding the impact on natural wildlife species? There's a couple about like whether the township's reviewed things, and I don't know because I'm not with the township. Does anyone on the township board have any personal or financial gain? Again, I don't know. I don't know that. Has the planning commission reviewed the contract? I don't know. I would imagine probably like the individual landowner contracts, probably not. Again, As a planning commissioner, that's not usually something that in a different place, that's not usually something that I would review. And so I think that this land use is no different than that. Will there be any local subsidies provided? Again, question for the township. Is there any obligation by the township to support any future projects requested by the company to support this project? And I don't think so. I'm not quite sure what would be associated with that. So that might be a good question. I'm going to pause for just a minute to take a drink of water and to let my kids slip by to get into the bedroom. So give me just 1 minute. The joys of working from home. Hannah, is there anything I should have said before I took that drink of water? Is there anything that you should add, or should I keep on? We're still on the questions that came in before the webinar. So I think that at least what I saw from the Q&A, where there was a number of repeats.
Yeah, a lot of what is coming in is really things that I knew kind of matched what came in before the webinar. So I think if they haven't already been addressed, they probably will be as we keep going through those questions. So if it's better to wait, we can go through those first and then do some of the questions that haven't already been addressed later on.
Got it. Okay. Let's see, I can't remember how many pages I put together, but the night is still young, so we still got some time. What waste products are produced or used by windmills? The thing that often comes up, or the concern that I've seen, many wind turbines, so there's different technologies. Many of the wind turbines that I've seen include like hydraulic fluid, effectively. There's a gearbox to keep things lubricated. The question is, how will this be disposed of so that area lakes are not affected? That is a good question. Generally speaking, you don't want fluids leaking out of your equipment anyway. Like from the developer's perspective, like they're checking that because they want that turbine to keep operating. But kind of what the plan is, that would be actually a good question for the developer. I'm going to mute for a minute while my husband goes down the creaky stairs. Sorry, folks. All right, let's see. There's a couple of questions about like what the developer is responsible for in terms of maintenance or disassembly, and what the landowner would be responsible for. And I would say all of that should be spelled out in the landowner agreement, in the leaseholder agreement. Again, I've seen a couple examples of like blank lease agreements, but this is in my initial study, right? To better understand like why I was seeing different things in different communities. And this is where I came to realize like, oh, kind of what lease agreements look like have evolved over time, whether, lots of people are paid or if only the people with turbines on their property are paid. So I do not profess at all to be an expert in wind turbine leases. This is a question that if you have specific questions about lease agreements, I can put you in touch with Michigan State Extension. They might know. I think they've done a little bit more work on that. And I know that they have counterparts at other state extension offices that have done a lot on kind of lease agreements. So again, if you're interested, feel free to email. And maybe Sarah, you can chat out my email address again, sbmills. There's a question about, is there an operating radius from the windmill that could encompass other landowners or land within the operating radius? And then I think relatedly, a question about, will there be a no build zone that encompasses the site surrounding the infrastructure that restricts what's built? So there's things that happen effectively like in the shadow of the turbine. You can farm that land. Like if you, in many places, if you want to build a house right underneath the turbine, you can. Some of that is organized, like is included in the zoning ordinance. So the zoning ordinance, my read of Pine Township's current zoning ordinance is that if you want to build a windmill, if you want to build a wind farm, wind turbine, that it needs to be set back from the property line. But there's nothing, and so really, in terms of the height of the height of the turbine, plus meet a number of other restrictions in terms of noise. But that's the primary one that I think most people can get their heads around. There's not a converse thing that says if you want to build a new house in Pine Township that it needs to be that same distance from the wind turbine or from the property line. So really, if the turbine is being put on a vacant parcel, currently a parcel that's just ag land, and there's no house right now, there's no reason why the owner of that parcel could build a house in the future, is my understanding. I also don't think that it's going to have an immediate impact on what the neighbors can do. It may have an impact, I'm not going to lie, it may have an impact on what they want to do with their property, right? What they want to build there, but it shouldn't have an impact on what they can build there. At least that's not my reading of Pine Township's zoning ordinance. Is that fair, Hannah? Like, do you think I represent that appropriately in your reading too? So the idea of a no build zone, not so much. And one of the things that like complicates this no build zone is some zoning ordinances have setback distances to not just to property lines, but to inhabited buildings. And like, so you have to kind of take into account what's inhabited at one point and what's inhabited in the next point. And I've looked at too many zoning ordinances recently, but I don't think, can you do a quick search and look up to make sure that the setback isn't from, there's not a setback from inhabited structures. And again, even in that case, the setback is when you're considering building turbines, not necessarily when you're considering building new buildings. And that's kind of the standard case.
So it looks like just from what from a quick search for large wind energy systems, there is a setback of the total height of the tower plus 20 feet, and that applies to the property line, right of way, utility line, and structures. Okay, got it. So it's not necessary. I mean, again, some have different setbacks, and so in some ways, this makes it simple to calculate all of these. Sometimes there's a different setback from like the right of way, and from property lines, and from different kinds of structures. Let's see, the sale of the project. So there were a couple questions about what happens if the developer sells the project to another developer. If company A sells to company B, are the terms fully transferable with no change in township recommendations? Will the obligations remain the same as in company A's agreements? And I would extend that to like agreements with individual landowners and agreements with the government. So again, zoning runs with the land. And so the other thing to acknowledge is that a lot of projects, a lot of wind energy projects do change ownership. It's not always the same company who's signing leases with you that builds the project, that owns the project long-term. Just like a mortgage is sometimes sold from one company to another, the same is true with like wind energy projects, because different companies specialize in kind of different parts of the process. That being said, some of them do see it, go from signing up landowners all the way to owning it, once it's built, and they're the same ones that are decommissioning. But on where it relates to the lease is that goes along with the sale. Like when the project is sold, the next company is beholden to everything that's in the lease. So it's really important to get things written down. Like that's the one kind of piece of advice that I would give is like, if you're the landowner, if you're the local government, to make sure that those things are included in the agreement. So within from the government's perspective, within the special land use, like when it's granted, if it's approved,
It is for the placement of that turbine. It doesn't from zoning's perspective, it doesn't make a difference who owns that turbine. If there are special stipulations, right? Like if what's shown on the site plan is that there will be a fence in a particular location, then the next person if the project is sold, the next person will have to maintain that fence. That fence needs to stay there if it's shown in the site plan. And so even if there are things that are not required for site plan approval, right? You don't change zoning to require something new, but is offered by the developer. If it's in writing in the site plan and that is the site plan that's approved, that is what has to be upheld by anyone that the project is sold to. So hopefully that addresses those questions. There were a number of questions that I think that came in beforehand that I put into the bucket of like, I think the presentation addressed this, which is property tax, like what will happen to property tax rates and property tax values. The experience in Michigan has been, like I showed the slide about overall taxable value. Across the board, it's added, like wind turbines are added value. They're a couple $1 million investment a piece, like maybe even more now. Like that number, it depends on like how tall the turbines are. Honestly, the cost of renewable energy has been coming down, but as turbines have gotten taller, like it's more of an investment. So I don't profess to know exactly how much money it is, but they're a multi-million dollar investment. And so even if in year 10, 12, they're taxed at 30% of the initial value, that's still it's still an increase. In some parts of the country, local governments have cut taxes because they've said like, we don't need any, like we're getting wind development is such a big increase in our taxable value. We have more money than what we know what to do with. And so we're just going to cut everybody else's taxes. When I talked to township supervisors and asked them about whether that's what well, first of all, to find out what they were doing with the tax revenue, but also to say, like, have you talked about cutting taxes? Most of them had said that they didn't plan on cutting taxes. They also, they didn't plan on cutting taxes because if they cut the taxes, the people who would benefit the most were the wind developers because they were also subject to that lower tax rate. So, but a lot of like kind of what those impacts are and kind of how much local schools benefit, again, it depends on the specifics. It depends on like what kind of debt funds, sinking funds your local district has, like what, kind of how much revenue you might have also depends on what your millage rate is. Permanent jobs per windmill, like again, this is based on our best estimates. There's a whole lot of national data about clean energy jobs, but I wanted to try to bring in a little bit more local and try to do in the communities where the projects are rather than globally for, all clean energy jobs, the engineering jobs, the, construction jobs kind of locally. So that I pointed to that fact sheet that we had done. And then question about infrasound and the impact that might have. And again, there's been a lot of studies. I'm not a medical doctor, so don't profess to know all of it. There's actually a decent amount of discussion about this in some zoning, the sample guidance for wind zoning that MSU Extension has put out. There have been a couple of iterations, and actually that was a question that I think I saw too. I don't know where it is on this list, about MSU Extension kind of guidance. So there was sample guidance many years ago. I can't actually remember how long. There was a change, there was another quick change, and then actually there was just some an overhaul effectively of the guidance in just in October 2020. And I was, helped look at that and helped review it. And so I think that there's a good kind of overview of the level of health science out there right now. I'm like, when I was classifying things ahead of time, this is the one that I called tricky questions, because I'll just tell you, like, I don't know the answers to. I want to acknowledge that they came in, but I'm going to, I'll tell you what I don't know, or kind of what I'm not sure about. Are landowners or township residents obligated to put at risk any defaults on business contracts from that the developers might have? I don't know. I've not gotten that question before. If the work on the project is unpaid by the company, how would a mechanics lien apply? I don't, and that's specifically to the landowner. I don't know. Again, that would be something, if you're the landowner, you might ask to see how. I have not heard that before. If public lands are used within the township, are the taxpayers liable for costs or any future costs to maintain these projects? I'm not sure. That's a good question, and a lot of that would probably depend on what public lands, state lands versus kind of county or township properties. And I'm imagining that, like, the easements associated with that, the lease agreements associated with that would clearly spell out any of those obligations. Will township residents be apprised of the entire project and be given notice for any ancillary equipment and projects that support this endeavor, like power lines, wells, pipes, access roads, lighting? Actually, that one should have gone back in the questions to the township official. I would assume so, but I'm not sure how that works and kind of what the regulations are for the associated things. Okay, I think, Hannah, I made it through the full list. We got 25 minutes to kind of pick up what else came in, and do let me know if more come in or you see things that are relevant. Thank you for grouping these.
Sure. And so, like I said, I think a lot of the questions that came in kind of overlapped with ones that we've already talked about, and or might have been addressed in the presentation. But if there's a question on one of those topics that maybe Sarah didn't answer in her presentation, feel free to just resend it to the Q&A, and we'll make sure that some of those more specific ones are answered.
Great.
But so far, one question is about crop dusting, and that there are people in Pine Township who use crop dusting, and wondering how this might affect that.
So this came up in another couple of places that I've been, and I don't think that was super common in some of the places that I studied. It hadn't come up before. So I called around to some crop dusters to understand that. And actually, Hannah, this is I think that there's an FAQ maybe about this. So one of the pieces of guidance that we've developed through Eagle is a frequently asked questions document. And I put together, Hannah helped put together an FAQ on crop dusting. It's been a while since I was asked that question, so I'm going to go for the best of my memory, which is there are some fields that have turbines on them that where aerial application is applied, that whether it's feasible, it really depends on the arrangement of the turbines, and that it's one of those things that you can't, none of the crop dusters that I called would make a blanket statement about. They were like, we need to look at it to see it. But my recollection is effectively their sense was it's probably going to increase the cost of aerial application for that field, depending on where it is. And it may make it impossible. But it was pretty localized, was my sense. Does that mesh with what you remember us putting together?
Yeah, and I think it should be on the website if you go and look at those FAQs. There's a written out answer to almost that exact question, which might be helpful. Okay. There was a question that just came in about blade breakage or hub breaking and damage that might cause to adjacent properties or structures. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
So this is one of the reasons why a setback distance is often applied. So wind turbine blades have broken in the past in the state of Michigan. So like it happens. They are, manufactured. There can be flaws in the manufacturing. Because it's so expensive to put them up, nobody wants that to happen, because then you have to get this big equipment back to these communities to fix it, but it can happen. And this is why there's a lot of questions about what's the ideal setback distance or safe setback distance. I think, like, without a doubt, minimum having a setback distance of the turbine height makes sense, because gravity is going to take over. All of the experiences that I have seen from Michigan, those turbine blades, when there has been a break, gravity has taken hold and it has fallen, not even a full, turbine height distance within the kind of radius of the turbine. There's also been an example of the nacelle, like the gearbox, effectively a turbine catching fire, right? It didn't cause a full collapse, but even if it did, having a setback distance of the turbine height just makes sense to protect neighboring properties, from kind of trespassing on those neighboring properties. And so that's does that fully answer the question, you think? Okay.
I think so. Okay, let's see what else we have. There's a question about, in your research, if there's evidence that wind energy impacts local tourism spending.
Not in my research. That's not something that I've looked at. There's a lot of there's a decent amount of research associated with this, but it's mostly about offshore development. And because the US doesn't have tons of offshore development, a lot of it is in Europe. And the idea is, like, does this impact tourism? And there's mixed evidence on that. The US research, actually, from the first offshore wind project in the US, which is Block Island Wind, which is in Rhode Island. My recollection of that research is that it does, it finds that there's new tourism, this was not, that there's tourism that's built up around that. I would not bank on that personally. Again, I will say that the expertise is on kind of the ag side, not on the tourism side. But also often that tourism, my sense is that it's part of the increase in tourism around Block Island is because it's a novelty, right? And so people who want to see offshore wind turbines are going to seek it out. There are other places in Michigan with wind turbines. So sometimes I get questions about, are we going to have wind tourism? And honestly, anecdotes from Huron County, kind of the first big place in Michigan with wind development, was that there were tour buses that wanted to see the turbines. I don't know, though, that that's it's a different kind of tourism. The impacts on existing kind of properties are, again, most of that is from Europe. And my sense is that it's mixed or negative, but I don't profess to know all of that. I can certainly say that the response to proposed projects in more tourist-based places tends to be more negative than in places that don't have that amount of tourism. But
okay, so there's a lot of questions that came in around taxes, setbacks. I think those are topics that we've generally talked about so far. There was a question about, I know you talked about some of the potential effects on the lakes in terms of recycling of the equipment, but there was a question about potential effects on water that industrial wind turbines might have, on water supply or surrounding water while in operation.
I haven't seen studies on that. Turbines have foundations. These are big, tall towers, and so they do have foundations that get dug into the ground. And so I would imagine that there could be impacts based on kind of where the water table is. I mean, it depends on how deep wells are, and that can vary from place to place. So I think that there are some localized questions about that, but I don't profess to know, and I don't think that there's any systematic, I haven't seen any systematic studies of that, about that.
Okay, and then this question, I'm just going to read word for word. What do you know about when companies creating LLCs and selling to their subsidiaries or LLCs, and depreciation occurs each time they sell, and if that's reducing revenues to the township?
Got it. So I know that there's a bunch of LLCs associated with energy development. I haven't tracked it, but just anecdotally, I've seen, there's a lot of LLCs. In terms of revenues for the township, again, I am not a tax assessor. So, but let me piece together the best information that I have, which is that the assessment, how much tax they pay, is supposed to be based on the total new cost. I don't know. I don't know if that starts over again when it gets sold. I would assume not, but that's one where I'm not quite sure. And I haven't heard that. Again, there's been no shortage of concern over taxation of energy development in Michigan. I'm not going to hide that. What I heard a lot in my research and ongoing is about, how many wind turbine, assessments, because each one is assessed individually. Each turbine has its own tax statement. How many of those assessments were tied up in tax tribunal? That's uncontrovertible. That's the truth. That had an impact on, local governments, in part, not knowing if they were how much of the tax bill they would need to refund, effectively not being able to use that revenue. And so from a community's perspective, even if the developer had paid something, right? From the community's perspective, they weren't seeing, in many places, they weren't seeing a lot of impacts of that. And that's concerning, especially because that is the tax payments are the community-wide impacts. I think that that's really important. So I don't want to sugarcoat that part, but my understanding is not that it's associated with the LLCs. This is the first time I've had that question, that it's more associated with, that a lot of it traces back to the implementation, the changes of the tax table, or subsequently, I think that some of those are still ongoing. So this idea, though, of what is the right taxable value is common in an ad valorem system. This is not the only land use where there's difference, and that's one of the critiques of the way that that a lot of this stuff is taxed. So it's not unique to energy development, and there are other ways to tax it, but then people say, well, then it's not standard. And so again, I teach a graduate class and we spend 3 weeks talking about taxation, property taxation, because I think it's so important, because it really is that's a key thing for the local government. And I think this is among the reasons why it's kind of lingered on, because sometimes I get the question, will there be taxes of this at all? I think that there has to be. This is really important for how local governments in the state of Michigan are funded. And I also think it's a really important part of the consideration when communities are thinking about how this fits in their townships, economic development plans.
Okay, great. Another question, does the developer receive federal or state tax dollars once a project is completed?
So right now, there is, I have not kept up with all of the changes. So historically, there's been a production tax credit, a federal tax credit associated with wind energy development. And it's been kind of a yo-yo. it's like been, extended for a couple of years and then let expire, and then it's, put back in place. And a lot of the energy development has, a lot of the amount of energy of wind energy development has gone along with it. So right before an expiration, you'll see a whole bunch of wind projects, and then not so much. But honestly, over time, it has phased out. There was a plan to completely phase it out. And I think that COVID kind of threw that up in the air because a whole bunch of projects were delayed associated with that. I don't know, honestly, the current status, but the idea of phasing it out, I think, will continue to come back. There's healthy debate over this, about whether there ought to be this subsidy. Kind of what subsidies do we give to different energy sources? One, and like, where is renewables, where are renewables in terms of like market maturity, right? They often you subsidize a technology early on to help make it more cost effective. The costs associated with the cost of wind energy development has come down so much that it doesn't really need it in many places, not universally, but in many places it's certainly not as important as it once was. And so I think that there's even my sense is, even among wind developers, there's a healthy sense of like how important this really is. Will they take it? Sure. Is it required? Not necessarily. But if it's going to be offered, like, of course they're going to take it. My understanding is that there's not a tax credit at the state level. I could be wrong in that, but I've never heard of one. So I'm pretty sure I'm right on that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, there was one question asking about the cost per kilowatt hour of producing wind power versus fossil fuel based generation. I don't know if there's data that we can point to on that.
So I don't have it in the slide deck. I normally have hidden slides, and I didn't put anything together this time. It varies from place to place, in part based on like how windy it is. That's going to change the cost per kilowatt hour of wind. Because again, for wind, whether you put a wind turbine in a very windy place or a not very windy place, the equipment costs the same, right? And so once it's built, the fuel is free. And so it pays for itself faster. Power is cheaper in very windy places. It also pays for itself faster, right? If you don't have to extend transmission, which is in places where the renewable energy resource is pretty similar, access to existing transmission is really important because you got to get that power to the users. The organization that puts together kind of the overall comparison of energy sources is called Lazard, L-A-Z-A-R-D. I'll type it out in the chat. Through the benefits of kind of going online and like doing this through Zoom, I can probably quickly find the link and share it out. If you give me 1 minute, Hannah. I'm 95% sure that the figure that I would pull from is here. And yeah, earlier today when we gave a presentation, like they're the source that we cite when we talk about the overall cost of solar going down. Again, it's going to vary from place to place, and even in the same state, right? The cost of one project to another is slightly different based on what equipment is used, but that provides some overall averages, and it also provides kind of the bars of like the cheapest wind project and the most expensive wind project and kind of the middle of the road. The important thing in that information is that it also, what I like about it is that it provides what the costs are subsidized and what the costs are unsubsidized. So this is where you can see, like, even without that subsidy, wind can compete. And this is kind of linked. Hannah, stop me if there's like way more questions, but we're getting almost, so when we're almost to the time. But I would just say, like, among the reasons that there's demand for this, like Hannah mentioned this, like when the utilities run their energy models for the future, the state requires that they kind of take into consideration all energy sources. Even with no state policy saying you have to have renewables, the utilities are saying that they're going to expand renewables in the future because their energy models show that that is the cheapest energy sources going forward. And that is, you know, making lots of assumptions about any subsidies phasing out, or kind of there's lots of assumptions about like what is the cost of natural gas, because that's kind of the most cost competitive alternate non-renewable source. And like they're still selecting, you know, they're still saying we're going to do more wind and solar. And so that's why we're seeing increased demand. At the end of the day, though, like they're not going to get it if they're like, they have to place it somewhere. And so that's why, you know, renewable energy, you can't just like close a coal plant and put solar or, you know, solar panels or wind turbines on that same piece of property. Just kind of the, you know, you can't line wind turbines up cheek to jowl. Like they need, like I said earlier, they need time to recuperate. So maybe that answered some weird question that came in along the way.
So I know we're running low on time. I'm going to try and fit in 2 or 3 more if we can.
Okay.
One question that came a few times is just wondering if you would encourage that Pine Township hear from people with different views, maybe different, you know, different from what we've shared tonight, or kind of have differing opinions on wind energy.
I think that there are lots of different opinions on wind energy. I think that often those voices come out. I think that having discussions about them is helpful. I think it's really important that people, like, again, it's really important that you understand kind of what everybody has a bias. Any speaker that you would have brings a bias with them. And understanding kind of what that bias is. I will say at the beginning, and I'll say it again, I started all of this from farmland preservation. So if there's a bias, it is towards farmland preservation. I should acknowledge that. And whether it's a speaker or it is diverse information sources, I think that it's really important to run it by the sniff test of whether the person is talking only about the pros or only about the cons. The fact is, all energy sources have impacts. All energy sources have positive and negative impacts at the local level. They all do. It doesn't make a difference what it is. And the reason, honestly, that I do what I do is because I was told from township supervisors who had wind projects in their townships that it was really difficult for them to get a straight story about wind energy when they were trying to decide whether or not, you know, trying to decide the zoning associated with projects. Hannah knows this. I often joke that I make everybody upset. And so if I made you uncomfortable tonight, like, you are not alone. I say positive things about wind energy that really upset people who think it's awful. And I say negative things about wind energy that really upset people who believe that it's great and it's the greatest sliced bread. I'm pretty sure that I'm an equal opportunity upsetter, and they're like, it's on both sides. I haven't gone back and looked at the Q&A, but I'm guessing that I can, from the past, I kind of know some of the critique. So that's kind of the test that I would run behind, any information source is like, what's the bias? And kind of, is it really like trying to get to facts and show that there's mixed evidence? So we can stay a couple minutes. If there's more questions, we can stay I can get a couple more minutes. I think my kiddo fell asleep. But.
All right, I have, there are 2 kind of zoning related questions. One kind of relative to what we talked about earlier, but wondering about the use of moratoriums put in place for reviewing zoning ordinances in Michigan.
That is an area of zoning that I confess I don't feel qualified to talk about. I know that there's like, this is where a zoning attorney would be really helpful, because I think that there's been some recent cases about like how long the moratoria can be, and under what circumstances. So that's, that's one that I think probably you need to ask your township attorney about.
And then one more kind of zoning related question, specific to Pine Township's ordinance. There are a few questions just about like what updates or additions you would recommend or suggest to the local officials that they might consider to make to their zoning ordinance regarding wind energy.
So some of the, and that kind of relates to some of the questions about like, has there been changes in the technology in that time? The top thing that kind of comes to my mind, one is the policy question, right? About, do we still think that wind turbines fit? Because the current zoning ordinance suggests that wind turbines fit. And again, you can look at your master plan and I can see the line that's drawn between those two things. One of the things that so if that's not how people feel, then there's a whole lot of changes probably that need to be made, because the ordinance is not sending that message right now. And that's up for the community to decide. Even outside of that, and I don't know necessarily that it needs a zoning change as much as this would be something that, I'm a planning commissioner, even if the zoning doesn't require it, we can ask for it. The developer doesn't have to give it to us, but we can ask for it, right? One is we talked about this about decommissioning and how often the developer is reconsidering the amount of money that it would take to decommission. I think that it's reasonable to assume that kind of the market for renewables, for the materials, will change over time. I don't know which direction it will go in. I really don't. But I think that's that's a common concern in communities, and it's not a showstopper in my mind to have something that reconsiders that. A technology that was not available, when the zoning ordinance was written, but that is now, is this kind of the ALDS, or the aviation ADLS. I always get the number or the letters wrong. Aviation detection lighting system, the one that turns the red lights off at night. In the guidance that is the 2020 guidance from MSU Extension, I really like what my colleagues at MSU Extension had written in about kind of the language that they had there, which is that the developer shall ask FAA for it. Doesn't require it, right? Because honestly, even if the developer wants to do it, the FAA has the final say about whether it can be used. But for communities where the night lighting is a concern, I think that is that's something that is a pretty easy inclusion. It comes with a cost. I'm not gonna lie. It's not free for developers to do it. Otherwise, that would be their default. But I think that actually the impacts of those lights are felt farther beyond the township. You can just see those lights from farther at, the turbines farther at night than you can during the day. And so that study would also let you know how often the lights would actually be turned off. In some places, it doesn't make sense because there's so much air traffic that the lights would rarely be off. But I feel that's a pretty low-hanging fruit thing that could be included. But it could be through an ordinance change, or it could also be just asked of the developer. Those are the two things that, in reviewing it, were some things. But I will be honest, Hannah, you read it much more thoroughly than I did. And that wasn't kind of the remit. I wanted to look at it so I kind of knew coming into this meeting, the presentation, what was kind of what the lay of the land was. But that, I'm happy if the Planning Commission wants me to do a more thorough review. That's one of the things, actually, kind of going back to the Eagle grant that we've been doing, is providing a read of ordinances and saying, what message does your ordinance send to developers? What we found from some of our Eagle work is that some ordinances are not sending the message that the township intends. So either because they haven't kept pace, the ordinance, there's documents saying from the township, we want to have wind development here, but they have a height limit of 400 feet. And, it's because their ordinance was written in 2008, when that was kind of, that seemed reasonable. Now turbines aren't going to be 400 feet tall. And so, so that's a reason to kind of revisit it. And if that's something that the township was interested in, like, that's one of the things that we can do as part of the grant. There also, I just want to highlight, because Hannah put this together, right? The resources that we have on Eagle's website that Hannah kind of curated, which we really tried to provide links to resources that didn't say, like, this is the right setback distance, because I don't think that there is a right setback distance. You need to think about what setback distance is going to achieve the goal that you want to achieve. And it helps you understand kind of what the pros and cons of different elements are. And so that's a place to go to. And I think that those, all of those links are available on the website. That was long, sorry. What, is there anything else? We've already run over, but.
Yeah, I think that's a good one to end on. There were, obviously a lot of questions that came in, but hopefully we got a chance to answer through the presentation and the Q&A, most of them, so.
Great. Well, again, our emails are there. Feel free to email me. If you've got questions, I may well pass it to Hannah, so you may see a response from her if she's not busy with finals. But thanks again for tuning in, and this will be up on YouTube and with links later on. And if you were able to submit your email address, we'll send you the link and let you know when that is and where specifically you can find it. Thank you very much, and have a good night.